Welcome, everyone. We are going to get started this afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for working with tribal communities. All right, just to get started with a couple items that you have seen before. This event was made possible under our grant awarded by the Office of Victims of Crime. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations throughout the presentation are those of contributors and do not necessarily reflect the official position or policies of the USDOJ. All right, a couple learning objectives before I turn it over to our presenter. We are going to be working through explaining two ways that historical traumas apply to Indigenous elders today. We're going to be covering gaining a deeper understanding of Indigenous peoples in the context of elder abuse. We are going to identify 3 ways to involve tribal partners in your work. And lastly, we are going to develop a greater understanding of cultural options for Indigenous elders. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Vicki, our wonderful presenter, and we will get started working through this material.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm really glad to see all of you that are here with me and joined us for this session. I myself am Dene and Hickory Apache, located out here in Colorado Springs, Colorado. You probably remember me from PLG meetings and other kinds of things going on with the National Center. And I just want to acknowledge, so my work has been centered around working with our tribes for several decades now. Red Wind, the agency that I primarily work for, we work intertribally. And what that means is we work across multiple tribes. So we're not focused on just one tribe, we work intertribally. And as a part of our work being centered within both the Office for Victims of Crime and the Office on Violence Against Women, we work with at least 100 tribes or more on an annual basis. So intertribally. So, and that's huge to understand the sheer magnitude of the number of tribes in the United States. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a framework around our Indigenous populations, where we're located, and then move into historical trauma, and then move into some more specifics that might be really helpful for you as a part of working with your elder abuse MDTs. And one thing that I think is so important for people to understand is that oftentimes, different settings that I've been in, people will be like, we have tribes around here. And I'll be like, yes, you do. You've got some tribes and you've got a lot of history on this land that you're standing on. And a lot of people think that all Native people live on reservations. And that is so far from what's actually the case. And so when we look at our Indigenous populations, around the turn of the century, so the 1900s, so dating myself, rolling into the 1900s, there were about 200,000 Indigenous people remaining on this land, the original land of Indigenous people, as a result of different practices that transpired in the formation of the United States government. And today, we're over 5 million in our populations across the United States. And as we look at the distributions of the tribes, we have 574 federally recognized tribes. And that's an important piece, and that federal recognition as a part of that falls under the relationship between the federal government and each of the individual tribal nations or Native nations. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means later. But you'll find areas where there's higher concentrations of tribes. So I live in Colorado. We have 2 federally recognized tribes in our state. And then you go to Arizona and there's 22 federally recognized tribes. You can go to other different states, and you'll have larger clusters of tribes, and then other states where you have much smaller numbers or no tribes, no federally recognized tribes at all. The other thing I want to acknowledge is that some states have state recognized tribes. So for instance, I have worked with tribes in the state of Virginia that were state recognized, that the state says we've got sovereign nations here residing within our jurisdiction and our boundaries, and have worked with them to support them and access different kinds of resources. And so there are hundreds of additional tribes that don't have the federal recognition. So that's an important piece to understand about tribes. So tribes are all over the country. And then when we think about where people reside, and as I mentioned, that a lot of times people think we all live on reservations. 8 out of 10 American Indians live in or near cities. And that's so 78% of our population lives off reservation. So here I live in Colorado. And so for an example, because of the way the Rocky Mountains are here, most of our population in the state is on the Front Range of the Rockies. And we have, and different people have different opinions, but we have about 90,000 urban natives on the Front Range. So enough for a good sized town when you think about that population. And shockingly for me living here, the services that are native specific to address elder abuse are nearly non-existent. So our advocacy, Redwin operates the Hosea Advocate Program. Our advocate program, which we also serve elder victims of intimate partner violence and sexual violence. And the closest other native specific response for our elder victims here in the state of Colorado is 5.5 hours away if you're going west or southwest, or if you're going east or northeast, we're talking about another 6 hours. And in our program, we have 3 advocates. So it's a teeny tiny program sitting within an urban center. And this is the case that we find all over the country. And so I give you my examples in Colorado because I'm the most familiar with it. I know in Los Angeles, there are over 200 tribes represented in Los Angeles in that urban center, and over 100 different languages spoken. And there are native specific programming, but oftentimes it's harder to find programming that's working on domestic violence, sexual assault, elder violence, elder exploitation that is native specific. So that's huge. And that's why I'm so glad to be able to talk to all of you and the work that you do, because we often think about where is the nearest tribe and are they in our service area? But what often is not talked about is where is the urban native population and they are in our service area, and what tribes are they coming from and how do we reach that population? So when we think about our elders, it's important for us to recognize the significance of who they are to us as Indigenous people. Not to say that non-natives don't care in significant ways about their elders, but historically with us culturally and within our custom and our practice and our traditions, our elders are the keepers of our history. They are the memories of our nations. They are the ones that carry forward our oral traditions. Benita, many of you know from our PLG and our work together, she talks about when an elder passes, a library burns because of all of the knowledge and history and language and everything that an elder carries. So for us, when we think about an elder, there's the work culturally about caring for our elders is so significant. It is intertwined in our culture and our practices and the way that we operate and we think in our communities. So when we think about that and thinking about traditional Indigenous beliefs about elders, so we talk about that they share and carry wisdom to ensure community permanency and balance. For me, from our Dene communities, we talk about Hojo, and the Hojo is how we carry harmony, how we walk in this world, and our elders are the ones who are the keepers of that knowledge, and help us to keep and remember that as a critical value for us as a nation. Elders preserve traditions. So they have carried for generations and generations, they have carried the traditions. And when we think historically, and I'll talk about historical trauma and the historical context for how things are playing out today in our tribal communities. But when we look at historically some of the harm that's happened to our nations, our elders have carried forward the healing practices that were in place prior to the harm, and have been able to carry it forward as a part of the resiliency that's held within our nations as well. They're the keepers of our knowledge. They hold unique, important social positions. So for me, when an elder speaks, and I myself am an elder as a 67-year-old Dene woman, that but for me, an elder, anyone who is an elder, someone my age or older, as they speak, I listen. I still am learning. I will always learn for the rest of my life. And so when we think about that important social position, as we gather in community and as our elders speak, we listen. And I remember at my younger years that when we would be in family gatherings, I always wanted to go sit at the feet of my elder relatives and listen to the stories that they were telling. And sometimes it was just funny stories, but there was always pearls of wisdom in there to listen to and to find and to hold. And then our elders are our advisors, our teachers, our healers, our spiritual leaders, and connectors to past and future. So they carry so much on so many different levels. And our elders are our relatives in many ways. Our mothers, our fathers, our sisters, our brothers, our grandfathers, our aunties, our uncles. And then as we think about historical trauma, it's important for us to talk about it. As we talk about elder abuse, and as we're working with an Indigenous elder with elder abuse, historical trauma is so intertwined. We cannot touch the current abuse without touching historical trauma. And so the more we understand how that plays out, and how it's carried today, helps us to be more effective as we're working with an Indigenous elder. So historical trauma, when we think about it, it basically is this cumulative, multi-generational collective experience. So it wasn't the experiences of one person, it was the experience of the nation. It was a widespread experience that was carried collectively amongst the citizens of that nation that experienced the trauma at and around the same time. We also talk about it as unresolved grief. And so when I think about that, there wasn't the support and the healing and the nurturing that's needed to recover from that kind of trauma. So it's carried in so many deep ways, to the point that it's actually scientifically been proven that it has imprinted on our DNA. So it's not something that, oh, you just get over it. It happened a long time ago. It actually has physiologically changed us individually and collectively. And so when we think about the historical trauma and being able to understand that, we can only understand it by understanding where it comes from. And so, and this is a timeline that was put together by myself and Benita, from Benita Ball. And the two of us kind of did some brainstorming together and created it. So when we look at the historical context for historical trauma, multi-generational trauma, and unresolved grief, it's a pattern of violence that was perpetrated over time. And we can see at the beginning of the violence, but it really culminated in the 1800s and the 1900s to such a widespread magnitude. And when we think about the violence that was perpetrated, and we as Indigenous people often talk about the genocide that transpired. So for me, it's important for us to realize that this violence came to different tribes at different times. So while this is a linear timeline, we can think about the onset of colonization. Most people think about it as happening through the eastern seaboard, where ships arrived. You know, we hear the stories of the pilgrims. We hear, and some people don't even think about those that came down the St. Lawrence Seaway in towards the Great Lakes and traveled through there. And then also thinking about the movement of the Portuguese and the Spanish that came up from the south, the lower east and south through Florida and up through the Gulf. But we also have the Spaniards that came up through what today is known as Mexico and the central part of the Americas. And Alaskan natives experienced the violence coming in from the Russians in through the Bering Sea Straits and some of the close lands between Russia and what is known as Alaska today. So these movements took place over different time. But what's significant about it, and I want to just acknowledge, this is just a representation of some things that happened, because there is so much more. We could write volumes about the different massacres, about the different acts of violence that transpired over time. So when we look at it, you know, so in the 1970s, as some of the tribes were being forced into different areas of land outside of their homelands, and losing access to resources that were basic for survival, food and hunting and gathering and protection. The different agencies were the US agencies were put in responsibility to help people survive by distributing foods and blankets and supplies and things like that. So in the 1970s was the onset of distribution of blankets that were infected with smallpox, which was quite a widespread disease across any of the populations in the United States. But Indigenous people who were not exposed to any of these types of viruses and bacteria and things like that, it caused even greater death than what was already being experienced by non-natives. And then we cannot, you know, and I'm just going to pick out a few basic pieces, but we look at the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears. And most people are familiar with the Trail of Tears, which forced the Cherokee from the lands that were around North Carolina and forced them to walk from North Carolina to the land that is now known as Oklahoma. And through that, elders died, children died, anybody that was weak died on that. And so there was widespread loss in that removal. And then there were massacres. And I was actually having a conversation with my sister yesterday, who just moved to Oregon, and we were talking about the Oregon tribes, which is an all new experience for her. And and talking about, it's like, so figure out, we looked up some of the tribes and talked a little bit about them and said, there's a history there, because we were talking about Sand Creek, the Sand Creek massacre that took place here in Colorado. I said, there are massacres that took place in Oregon. And so you, as a person that's not from one of the local tribes, look and find out where those massacres took place and learn about it, because that's the history of the people whose land you're on. And then we also can look at in the 1900s. So I am also asked all the time by different peoples, like, why is this important? Why is all this old history so important? Well, when we talk about historical trauma that has imprinted on our DNA, we can see how it was building over time. But then when we pause and we look at the 1900s and think about the elder populations we are working with, many of them have lived through this. So I am 67 years old, born in 1956, and policies of termination were really that's when that was taking place in the 1950s and into the 1960s. Policies of termination was where the federal government was attempting to figure out how to relinquish its treaty obligations. And the treaties were designed and written in a way that they stay in effect, basically as long as the river flows, the wind blows, the sun rises, and if climate change doesn't do us in, those treaties will stay in place forever. So the federal government saying we can't keep doing this. So the policies in terms of termination came about, and it was what I say, like an experiment that was taking place. And one prong of that was removal of federal recognition for tribes. So it was a way that they basically said, now we're kind of questioning whether you are in fact a real tribe. So we're just going to say we're not going to recognize you anymore. So that stripping that recognition away had a major impact on multiple tribes. So for instance, one tribe I work with out of Oklahoma, a large part of their population is located in Oregon. And so they're trying to work with their population in Oklahoma and work with their, a large part of their citizenship located in Oregon. Another tribe actually in Virginia that just got recognition after going through all of this policies of termination. They just got their recognition back in 21, and a large part of their population is located in Pennsylvania, and trying to figure out how do we serve our citizens in two different major locations. Another part of the termination has a direct impact on why so many of our population lives off tribal land. And the intent of that policy was called relocation, where they actually worked with populations, went to tribes and basically said, hey, we're going to help you move out of this area, go to an urban center. We're going to provide you a stipend to get set up in this city. And that's why we look at places like Los Angeles, Seattle, Denver, Chicago. And there's multiple other cities around the country that have large urban native populations. And it's because of that relocation. But what has happened, and the intent of that policy was to breed out the treaty obligation because of the diminished blood quantum that would happen by having children of mixed race. And what ended up happening with the policies, that particular portion of policies of termination, was that it created a migratory process for our tribes. So like, again, thinking about Denver, and I've seen it from different areas, is that we look at the population that's in the Denver area. There's a huge region that covers, not just in Colorado, but all of the surrounding states that come to Denver for college, go back home, come to Denver for medical care, stay maybe for a few years, go back home, come to Denver for jobs, go back home. And I saw that also true in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area for a lot of the Anishinaabe tribes, where they would come in and go back, come in and go back. And so there's this migratory process that's happening from these urban centers where people are back at their home reservations and stay in the urban area. And then there's people that were, they grew up, they're a child of that was born, in the urban center. And so they're an urban native. They have their citizenship connected to their tribe, but never have lived on the reservation. And so there's, a mixed relationship that's playing out there. And the third policy of termination was about transferring federal jurisdiction to states. It was an unfunded mandate. States were not consulted, tribes were not consulted. It created tension between the states and the tribes because the states are saying like, geez, we've never had to go and police tribal land. We're not going to go on a tribe. We don't have the financial resources, the staffing to cover these tribal lands. And so it created this tension. There are still counties where the sheriff will not go onto tribal land, and the tribe doesn't have the infrastructure to police because of the public law 280 that was passed back then. So that still has long-lasting consequences. And then the other one I want to point out significantly is the boarding school era, because that is huge. And a lot of people say, well, we're talking about the impact on children, but those children are elders today. They grew up, many of the elders were forcibly removed from their home, placed into a boarding school, prevented from speaking their language at a time when that was their only language, having their hair cut culturally, which is a very spiritual thing to have long hair. It's a spiritual practice across our tribes, and being forced to assimilate. And elders today, there are elders that I talk to that share a story that they've never shared before from their experiences from boarding school. And we also know from the boarding school era, there was a lot of physical violence and sexual violence that was perpetrated. And some of the folks on this call have heard me talk about how areas around boarding schools in the most recent last couple years, 2-3 years, we are finding many graves, unmarked graves of children that were killed or died in boarding school. So our elders are carrying living memories from the boarding school era. So when we look at this historical trauma and these multiple different things that have been playing out, and then intertwine that with racism, discrimination, and distrust of institutions that have historically been majorly problematic, we can see that how this historical trauma plays out today. It plays out in terms of disease. It plays out in terms of still having mistrust. We have many elders who still have not told the stories of what happened to them. They have not been able to get the help to deal with what happened to them. And then they're dealing with something today. And so when we touch this current incident, we are touching this historical trauma, and we can't touch one without touching the other and addressing the other. So for me, as somebody who has worked in our communities for many, many years, that it's important to realize that sometimes what appears to be really a straightforward response for an Indigenous elder tends to be way more complex. Because when we touch that current situation, we're starting to open up this bigger stuff. So then the other piece, and I did talk a lot about that, the stuff that happened in the 1950s, there's other kinds of things. I didn't talk about the Major Crimes Act, which places some jurisdiction on tribal land in the hands of the federal government. So clearly, when we think about our tribes, one thing that many people don't understand is the unique relationship that tribal nations have with the federal government. And that unique relationship transfers to the citizens. And I'll explain that here in just a minute or two. So when we think about this nation-to-nation relationship between the US federal government and our tribal nations, there are, one is our tribes are sovereign nations. So our tribe makes their own laws, operates as a complete nation. It has its full leadership. And some people don't understand that. They think of it as a smaller, like a county government or something like that. And I just want to be really clear. We are talking a nation, a sovereign nation that resides on the land here in what is known as the United States. And that is so critical to understand, because in working with Indigenous elders and the migratory practices that our Indigenous populations operate within, that we may end up be sitting in an urban center or an area off tribal land, having an elder come before us through a referral or however that's going to work with our MDT, and the crime occurred on tribal land. So then we're talking about a different set of laws, a different jurisdiction, and an entire new government that we have to have some base level of understanding to work with. And what I have seen over the near 40 years that I've been working in the field that I've been working in is that not understanding this is the critical part where harm gets caused, where people don't understand how you're working with two jurisdictions oftentimes at the same time, that and those, one being a federal jurisdiction, another being a tribal jurisdiction, and then sometimes even having a third state jurisdiction playing out in there, that not understanding how that goes and knowing enough to say, I need to get more help, or I need to reach out to another specialized tribal resource, ends up doing more harm, because then it's either a partial response or a response that's not recognizing tribal law, and it becomes hard to unravel it after that. So understanding that is core, and it's a whole other training. I mean, like, it could be days. So I just want to say that and give you enough to say, okay, so this is an Indigenous elder. We know what happened over here within tribal land. Let's figure out what other resources we can pull in. And like, one of the big resources I reach out to is the American Bar Association. And I would say, I need someone who understands tribal law with this tribe in this state dealing with this issue. And they are one of the best resource places for me. Because I, of course, I am Dene and Hickory Apache. And I've been working intertribally for a lot of years. There is no way I can know tribal law across 574 tribes. So Native people are also looking for resources as well. So understanding that is a critical part of being able to have some of the strong responses for our elders, and critically to not do harm, to provide some of the most effective supports. I also like to talk about the Violence Against Women Act, and part of that is because one is I do a lot of work with domestic violence and sexual violence, and that is a big area that I am seeing a lot of elder abuse that is not being addressed. And our elders are having to find ways and language to even talk about violence. So the closer an elder is to their language, the harder it will be for them to describe physical or sexual violence, because their language of their heart doesn't have the words for it. So there are many of our tribal languages do not have words to describe these kinds of physical and sexual violences. So as an elder coming and talking about some of this, oftentimes we hear that an elder will say they bothered me. And some people say, yeah, but that's not our job to deal with, somebody bothering you. And we'll dismiss it and not stay present long enough to find out they've been raped. So being able to understand a little bit about how an elder, an Indigenous elder close to their language, will communicate that is important. And then recognizing that through the Violence Against Women Act in 2005, there was a section created to work at helping to strengthen the responses within our tribes, as well as we're seeing responses outside of our tribes addressing the safety for our Indigenous populations. So the safety for Indian women, and it's because it's the Violence Against Women Act, it serves all genders and gender identities, but it's titled Safety for Indian Women, but it clarified full civil jurisdiction of tribal courts for protection orders. And what we see still today, so from 2005, so almost 20 years, we still have problems in this country having a protection order that is written and, put out by the court within a tribal court not being honored off tribal lands. Because people often say it doesn't look right, it doesn't match what the state administrator's putting out, and the tribe doesn't have to. It's got full faith and credit. And anybody who's got federal funds and it's not upholding tribal protection orders and find that they're on repeated offenses of it, it could jeopardize all their federal funds. So good thing to know. Some people say, oh, it'll jeopardize your Office on Violence Against Women funds. And what I have found out, it could jeopardize all your federal funds. So that catches people's attention when a court or a law enforcement is basically saying it's not good enough. And then one of the problems that happens also is people say, well, let's just use this protection order as a basis of getting a new protection order. And my argument is you are diminishing the sovereignty of this nation. This is a sovereign nation. You need to honor this protection order, and you're also creating more barriers for an elder victim to get protection by putting them through extra hoops to go through to get their protection orders honored. So that's critically important. 2013 created tribal jurisdiction over crimes of domestic violence, and that was addressing tribes having jurisdictional authority over non-natives committing that crime on tribal land. Not all tribes get that. They have to apply to the U.S. Department of Justice to get that. And in VAWA 22, it moved to tribal criminal jurisdiction. So it included domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, stalking, sex trafficking, child abuse, and a couple other things in there. So non-natives often flee off tribal lands when they've created crimes. There's multiple different remedies to address that, and partnerships between tribes and states to address that as well. Tribal Law and Order Act passed in 2010, and it brought really some significant things. And one of the things is that I think is really important is recognizing concurrent jurisdiction. And this has been in place since treaties back into the 1800s, where the federal government has been saying we recognize the concurrent jurisdiction of tribes, and Tribal Law and Order Act, and as a part of that concurrent jurisdiction, basically put it back into law again and said tribes have concurrent jurisdiction. So a tribe can prosecute and a federal government can prosecute, and it is not double jeopardy. A tribe can prosecute and a state can prosecute, and it is not double jeopardy. It is concurrent jurisdiction. And that is important to know. And it's important that there is communication and cooperation between the jurisdictions and the sharing of evidence and investigation information from investigations to really support the prosecution. Sometimes the federal government will decline to prosecute and the tribe will prosecute, or vice versa. And occasionally they will both choose to prosecute. So when we think about the partnerships and working with tribes and involving a tribe in an MDT, so say for instance, you're located off reservation and there's a tribe nearby and they're in your service area. One thing that's critically important is that maybe someone from social services within the tribe says, well, I'll come to the EMDT meetings. And that's fine. And that's great. And they can serve as a great partner and educating, but you cannot kind of reciprocate and say, well, we're going to go in and we're going to work in the tribe without clearing it with the tribal government. So you literally have to take that. So if you think about it comparatively, you have to take it to Congress, right? So when you go into the tribal nation, if you want to work in the tribe and serve that tribe as a part of your service population on tribal land, you need to clear it. So if you've got a partner within human services or social services within the tribe, they can help you move to talk to tribal leadership. And I would say first, before going to tribal leadership, I would want to talk to tribal administration and to say, hey, this is what we're doing. How can you help me with this? How can you, how can we make a good partnership? And what are the things that I need to do? So I myself, as an Indigenous person, I used to work in Duluth, Minnesota, and that is Anishinaabe country. So I am clearly not Anishinaabe. And I was the director of American Indian Community Housing Organization when I was there, and we served a large population of the Fond du Lac Band in an urban setting. So we wanted to work with the tribe. So I started with who are the people from Fond du Lac that I know, and asked them to help introduce me to the tribal administrator. And then actually one person, can you accompany me to the meeting with the tribal administrator? So I went through a process of getting the audience with the tribal administrator, multiple meetings with the tribal administrator of what I wanted to do, what we were trying to accomplish, how we could work together, and what the benefit for the tribe would be by working with us and us being able to serve them within the tribe. And then after the tribal administrator fully understood and felt like this was a good thing, then they got me on tribal council agenda so that I could then take that to tribal leadership and do my presentation, share my materials, and give them space to deliberate on it and make their decision. So there's a process, and it takes time to build those relationships to be able to have that ability. So some of the tribes don't have an adult protective services program. So there's a benefit for those of you that are working within adult protective services to say, hey, we can bring some services to you if you want it, and follow a similar process. And finding the partnerships and who are the people that can help walk you forward. And it takes time. And I always tell people passion, and passion, are both of it. So that patience just really, it's a process of moving forward, because the other part in there, remembering the historical context for the violence, many people are still dealing with, the consequences of that and some of the ongoing current challenges from different laws and violence that still plays out today. So that patience with persistence is such a critical part of building those relationships. For me, it took me a couple years to get into tribal council, to get that decision. And once I got in there and got the decision and the support and the relationship, I left that organization 20 years ago. That relationship still exists. So it was worth it. It wasn't a passing relationship. It was a long-term relationship that got formalized and was really, really, really helpful in the long haul. So then as you think about different ways, so that's a formal relationship to work on tribal land. But if you're working in an urban center and maybe you're not going to work directly with a tribe, you want to work with Native partners. There in urban centers, there are tribal offices for some of the tribes that might be located within the state. So for instance, in Minnesota, I know in the Twin Cities, Red Lake, which is the furthest north, Anishinaabe tribe in Minnesota, they have a tribal office in Minneapolis, St. Paul. White Earth, which is close to Red Lake, also has a tribal office, and there's a few other tribes that have tribal offices in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And so tribal offices and inviting them to come and learn what you're doing. If you're doing any kind of trainings, inviting them to come and learn would be a good way to open some doors. But that's not the only people. There might be a Native-based domestic violence or sexual assault advocacy program. There could be a resource center or an Indian center or an Indian health center that could be in those areas. So you can reach out to them too. And I always think about what can I give them? It's not about what you can give me. It's what can I give you? How can I support you? What do I have to offer to you? So that's the way I make my approaches. And I always try to bring resource packets and different kinds of tidbits of information to really enrich and support the work that they're doing. So there's many, many different ways that can be done. And I think the important thing in there is we do all of that work and we come with cultural humility, recognizing, and as I acknowledge myself, that I will never know everybody's culture across the different tribes. And so I go in and I work at, I recognize sovereignty, and I also come in with respect. And I try to pay attention to what's going on around me and, just try to communicate in ways that fit. So, and this is something, so a friend of mine who's a former U.S. attorney from Michigan, her name is Leslie Hagan, and she works at the executive office of the Attorney General. And she talks about going out and visiting tribes. And she says, you don't go out in your Fed outfit, which for her was a blue suit. You do not show up looking like a Fed. I always dress up when I go and I visit a tribe. I'm a blue jean kind of gal. I'm wearing blue jeans right now. But when I go to visit a tribe, I put on my slacks, I dress up a little bit, but I don't go to a suit. So you don't want to come in looking like a Fed, but you want to respect and honor them by putting the effort into your appearance. And then also, part of respect is listening, asking a few questions and really listening to what people have to say. And then when I visit a tribe, so for instance, I'm getting ready to visit the Shoshone Paiute of the Duck Valley in northern Nevada, and I have spent time on their tribal website learning about their tribal history, learning about their migration and what has happened to that tribe, learning about the land that they're on today and the services that they have to offer, so that I'm at least having some base level of understanding when I go in. And then I'm a guest on tribal land. So if they're going to change stuff up on me, I'm not going to get stubborn and argue that. I'm going to go with the flow. And then I always bring something, extra materials, a booklet, information about a training that's free in the area, stuff like that. And then sometimes I also have what I call swag. So because of the pandemic, I haven't been able to go out places. So my stock is kind of down to nothing. So I've been building up my stock, and I have these little notebooks which you can't see very good. So little notebooks that I might have a couple notebooks I'll bring, or a medicine bag, or, a keychain, or just different things that I can give as gifts to maybe the person that is my point of contact and hosting me, which I think is such an important part of saying, I'm not here to take from you. I'm really here to support you and to give to you as much as I can. And then I can learn from them. And that's important. So that cultural humility is to recognize that that they are my teacher, but I also educate myself to some degree. So I'm not going in completely not knowing. And when I visit a tribe, and it's not usually part of my agenda, I will often try to figure out, do they have a cultural center, a cultural department, a museum, or something like that? And I will make it a point to go there. And if I can, I try to do it the day before I start my work so that I can learn a little bit that way. And then I think it's so important to recognize all the expertise. So as we think about working together with an EMDT, we are leaders together, as our Indigenous partners have a lot of knowledge, and they are often leaders in their own community. And what we will also find is that they may even be leaders in the region. And that's important to recognize that. And then we work together as leaders, and we also advocate. So for me, as I look at many of the non-natives on this call, is that you have an opportunity to advocate on behalf of the tribe and to support the tribe and help them know that you've got their back too. So it's not just about this little bit of a relationship here, it's even bigger than that. The more you learn about the tribe and how to support the tribe, then you can say, hey, what about the tribe? How is that going to affect the tribe? How is this policy going to affect the tribe, or an Indigenous elder that we're working with? And community organizers, for me, it's about, we have the opportunity to create change in this world. And that's a firm belief of the way I was raised, is that we have a responsibility to change the world, to create what we want to see in the world. And that's part of organizing, helping other people to see it. And then we look for the gaps. As we look at our community and we see the tribes, are we working with Indigenous populations? Are we outreaching to the Indigenous populations? So we want to look at and figure out what kind of gaps there are. And when I think about the work that we do, this is all healing work. And you working with elders, as you work and heal this one elder, you have the ability to bring healing to the whole tribe. You're not directly going to the tribe and bringing that healing, but by your work with this one elder, as you heal this one person, you are healing the community as well. So this is powerful, sacred work that we are doing, as we are particularly working with our elders. And when we think about working with our elders, as we think about healing the trauma of being financially exploited, the trauma of experiencing physical and/or sexual violence, as we think about what can be healing for an elder, there are cultural activities, and even in urban centers. Here at Colorado Springs, our program has a sweat lodge. And so when we offer a sweat, we let our Indigenous community know that we're having a sweat, and we let people know that they can come, even if they're not part of our service population. So there's different healing ceremonies. There's traditional medicines that are offered. I look over here and my smudge is not close to reach, but our programs, we have zipper bags with medicine. We put in sweetgrass. So we work intertribally. So we put sweetgrass, we put plain sage, we have white sage, and we have Dene pollen, and we have Pueblo pollen. And then we also will have tobacco. And different forms of kinds of tobacco, traditional Indigenous tobacco. And those are all medicines that we make available to those that we serve as a part of it. And sometimes I sit and because somebody who grew up in an urban center, they may not know their traditional medicines as closely. So I will offer it to them and I ask them, would you like to smudge? Would you like to use sweetgrass? And, would you like to use pollen? And if you would like, and you want some help with that, I can offer that to you and offer you a teaching with it. And then we have to remember the interconnected relationships that our people have, which plays out into the roles within family and the community. And I know there's been times I've worked with somebody and somebody shows up and it's like, there's like 12 people with them. That's family. My son, when he was sick, we all moved in almost to the hospital. It was family. It's like, wow, there's a lot of you here. And that's us. And language, we support our Indigenous elders in their language and in their spirituality and their spiritual practices. So I just want to acknowledge a couple of resources. So as I talked about historical trauma, the last slide in here has some information where you can go onto the internet and find that. And then also VAWA Title IX, there's a website here, and then also on the Tribal Law and Order Act. And I put both Bonita's and my email address on here, and then Redwind's website. And then I just want to do an OVW plug for one of our TA projects. We work on, we have one project called Responses for Urban Natives, and we actually can work to strengthen non-native programs' ability to more effectively serve urban native victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, sex trafficking, and stalking. And so with that project, we actually, we've got a grant for it, so it pays for our time and it allows us to work with folks. So if there's ways and it fits in terms of elder within those working in responses to elders within those 5 covered crimes with OVW, we can also provide additional TA on that beyond the elder abuse TA that we provide through this OVC project. Oh, that's an hour.
Thank you so much, Vicki. If there are any questions, please feel free to unmute or drop them in the chat. I know that we just hit the top of the hour. Vicki is such a wonderful resource for all of your questions surrounding tribal communities and their needs, specifically for those dealing with elder abuse and abuse in general. Please feel free to use her email, reach out, and connect with her. I am going to be dropping a survey, a brief evaluation in the chat. Please take a few seconds to share your feedback. It's very helpful, and a huge thank you to Vicki. This presentation, this is the second time I've seen it, and every time I feel like I pick up something new and engaging. So a huge thank you to her for spending this time with us. Thank you all for attending.